Thanks, Anna. And thanks everybody for joining us. In case you haven't read the news yet today is a big day for climate. And so our socially distant happy hour is very well timed. And we're going to be covering some of the exciting stuff that's happening in the news today. But first, since we have a lot of attendees who are newer to Advocates for the West, I just want to give a quick introduction to who we are and what we do. We're a public interest law firm that provides legal counseling and litigation services, primarily in federal court and primarily over public lands and wildlife issues. We represent the interests of our partners, not ourselves. And those partners range from big national groups like the Center for Biological Diversity, to small grassroots groups like the Western Slope Conservation Center, whose executive director is here today. And from concerned individuals to the Nez Perce tribe. We represent a slew of different clients, and we represent them in cases across the West. So we're a West-wide firm. In my docket alone, actually, we work to defend special places stretching from the coast of California to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, and actually from national forests along the northern border of our country down to the borderlands of Arizona. So we've got a big footprint across the West. And today, we are going to be talking about a few different things. First, I'm going to be talking about where we are. We can't start talking about where we want to go under this administration until we take stock of what's happened over the last 4 years. So I'm going to recap some of our existing cases challenging Trump administration decisions, and then I'm going to turn it over to Tanya Henderson, who's the executive director for the Western Slope Conservation Center, and she's going to spotlight one of our existing cases. And then we're going to bring it home with our senior attorney, Todd Tucci, who's going to walk us through what's already happening under the Biden administration and give you a bit of a preview for what it might mean for our work. Slide, Anna. I guess we already did that one. Next one. Sorry about that. All right. So obviously everyone's super excited about things that are already happening, and it brings up a good question of, whether or not people like us can just go on vacation for the next 4 years, because this new administration is just going to be able to take care of everything themselves. And I really wish that was true, because it's been a long 4 years. But there's some important things to keep in mind as we transition to this new administration. The lawsuits that I'm going to talk about in a minute are not going to magically disappear. You might have read that one agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, already issued a cease and desist order almost to the Department of Justice, telling the Department of Justice to freeze existing litigation. But we haven't seen that in our cases yet. And so our existing cases are plowing forward. Another important thing to keep in mind about the new administration is that a lot of our cases actually deal with issues that span across the administrations. So some of our cases, like challenging the management of the Willamette and the Hells Canyon dams in Oregon, for example, a lot of our cases dealing with grazing in special places and bighorn sheep conflicts, those are types of cases that existed under previous administrations and are likely to continue. There are also a number of harmful decisions that we know are on the horizon. These include the Point Reyes management plan that if you get our email blast, you've heard a lot about, the Stibnite mine, the Midas Gold issues in Idaho, wildlife services issues that have been going on for years, and so there's still a lot that is likely to happen. And positive administrative and political advocacy takes a lot of time, and so that's some of the stuff that Todd's going to cover in a bit. And so, Anna, if you want to go to our next slide, we can start recapping some of the lawsuits that we have on the books already to address Trump's energy dominance agenda. And so if you've been paying attention at all in the last 4 years, this was the big piece of what happened with public lands and wildlife under the existing administration. So one good example is the Trump administration significantly increased oil and gas leasing and permitting throughout the West. What did we do? We filed a lawsuit that helped vacate oil and gas leases across nearly 1 million acres of sage grouse habitat across the West. That was a big deal. And that case is currently up on appeal before the Ninth Circuit. There are a number of oil and gas companies and trade groups that have tried to intervene. And so there's a lot still happening in that case that is still going to be moving forward, in the coming months. Another great example, the Trump administration rolled back protections in management plans across the West for sage grouse issues. What did we do? We filed a lawsuit, won a big injunction that enjoined those rollbacks, affecting 51 million acres in 7 Western states. So I just want to highlight the scope of some of these cases and some of these decisions that we saw across the West under the last administration. I mean, these decisions can affect vast areas of these Western states. And so that's why, there's a lot that happened and there's a lot to do. Next slide, Anna. Couple other examples. So the Trump administration, you probably heard this was a big one in the news, slash protections for Bears Ears and Grand Staircase National Monument. What did we do? We teamed up with Conservation Lands Foundation to help with that litigation. Same thing, Trump prioritizing fossil fuel development and resource management plans across the West. What did we do? We filed a lawsuit challenging the resource management plan for the Uncompahgre area in Western Colorado. And that's what we're going to focus on today for a bit. So I'll give Anna, if you want to move forward. So this was an exciting case. The resource management plans, if you're not familiar with them, they're a blueprint for what happens on public lands under the Bureau of Land Management's control. And so they govern the lands for 15, 20, 30, 40 years sometimes, and they determine what can happen where. So where oil and gas leasing can happen, when it happens, under what conditions, what areas are devoted for recreational uses or wildlife conservation. And so that's why these resource management plans are so important. And, going back for a second, that's why the decision to roll back the rollbacks in those sage grouse management plans across such a vast area out West was such a big deal. But with this UFO, as we call it, the UFO RMP, this one covered about 1 million acres of federal mineral estate, which is, it's this weird thing out West where the oil and gas leasing rights are held by the federal government, even if in some places where the private lands, the lands above they're privately owned land, sorry. And so federal mineral estate and public lands involved in that decision. And what did the Trump administration do? They opened up every last acre that they had discretion to under that plan. It was a big reversal on some protections for special places like lands with wilderness characteristics and areas of environmental concern. And so those are just a couple of the reasons why we challenge this lawsuit, because of the energy dominance agenda that we saw. One of the themes in this case involves really top-down dictates from Washington, D.C., where the energy dominance agenda overruled local BLM officials, what local communities wanted, to put the politics before the science in that instance. And so, our partners in this are one of our existing clients, the Wilderness Society, but the Western Slope Conservation Center and the Wilderness Workshop are new clients. And I'm going to turn it over to Tanya, the Executive Director of the Western Slope Conservation Center, to tell us a little bit more about who she is and why this management plan is such a threat to her organization.
Yeah, thanks, Lizzy. So I'm Tanya Henderson. I'm the Executive Director of the Western Slope Conservation Center. And to just give sort of a little background for our organization, we're a small 501c3 conservation nonprofit that's based out of Paonia, Colorado, located on the western slope of the Rockies, as one might guess from our name. And we're an organization that's been around for over 40 years, advocating for the land, air, and the water of the lower Gunnison watershed. And so we drain into the Colorado River eventually. but are just in a really beautiful area out here in Colorado. The organization began as a very hyper local organization to try to fight water quality issues created by 3 coal mines that were operating at the time. Now we only have 1 coal mine still operating in the area. But as we started to realize, lands are interconnected, and what happens on public lands affects private lands and vice versa, our scope has changed. So we're not as hyper local Paonia focused anymore. And a lot of our public lands work, is based on this notion that our local economy relies on healthy public lands and healthy ecosystems. As we've transitioned away from a heavy reliance on the coal industry to keep this area afloat, we are now starting to rely on agrotourism, agricultural ventures. The North Fork Valley, where Paonia is located, is one of the highest concentrations of small organic farms in the nation and the highest in Colorado. And so our economy relies heavily on dependable water and clean systems. We also have sort of a burgeoning recreational economy that relies on having, these gorgeous, pristine public lands all around us. And having been through the back and forth with, the boom and bust of a coal-driven economy, we know that an oil and gas-based economy is not going to create anything sustainable in this area, which is why we've worked so hard to protect the resources that we have out here. And we can move on to the next slide. And, it's funny that we find ourselves in a lawsuit. In our 40 years of history, we've been a solutions-based organization. We've had agreements in the past with the coal mines, knowing that they're our neighbors. And that just comes from being a small community-based organization. We can't drop in and dictate priorities and leave. We're a part of the community. And so we know we have to work with the community and figure out what's in the best interests for everybody, while obviously espousing our conservation values. And so as a solutions-based organization, when the BLM had this resource management planning process, when they started it, we rallied together the community. We made sure that people showed up at the public input meetings. And when the alternatives, so the scoping started back in 2010. And then after 6 years of scoping, the alternatives were presented to the community in 2016. And none of those alternatives were anything that the community felt like they had been asking for or telling the BLM the way they wanted to see the public lands around us managed. And so we rallied back again and came up with a community plan that was actually folded in and incorporated into the alternatives that the BLM was considering. And that was a major coup for us, because normally the alternatives in those resource management plans are very much decided by the BLM offices. And our North Fork alternative plan was adopted as one of those alternatives straight into their planning process. So we thought we had, sort of cause for celebration, and we thought we were being heard and being listened to. But when the record of decision came out, it had chosen an alternative that was by far more, energy, with this emphasis on energy dominance, than anything that was presented in the scoping process, in the, draft RMP. It was an alternative that was introduced not even a year before the record of decision, which I know sounds like a long time, but in this planning process was sort of 11th hour. It was not something that we got to meet about, not something that we really got to comment heavily on in public forums. And it was something that even the governor of Colorado sort of called out and said, this is not what this planning process has led up to. We object to this being the preferred alternative, or the decision. And that's also why we're in a lawsuit now. We think that there was a miscarriage of justice. We do not think that the process happened in the way that it is supposed to happen. And for us, this is a big step as a very solutions-based organization. This is our first lawsuit in 40 years, and we've been really grateful to sort of be able to lean on organizations with an even larger scope and a deeper base of expertise than ours, like Advocates for the West. We would not be able to represent our community values and our community voice without Advocates for the West shepherding us through this process. And so we're really, really grateful, because we've done a lot of work in the last decade to make sure we know what we're talking about. And we just need to make sure that that's heard in the ways that it needs to be heard. And then also, Lizzy mentioned the Conservation Lands Foundation earlier, and they're another wonderful group that sort of unites small groups like ours, grassroots groups that work on public lands, to make sure that our voices can be elevated when, when such horrible things happen, like we end up with 95% of our public lands open to oil and gas leases. And yeah, I mean, I'll turn it over to Todd, I think, at this point, to sort of talk us through what happens next and why this case is still a case and hasn't just disappeared with all the executive orders that have rained down today.
Okay, thank you, Tanya. My name is Todd Tucci. I'm a lawyer at Advocates for the West. And I've just been told I've celebrated my 18th anniversary, which means I think Advocates has been around for about 18 years. So that's exciting on both fronts. I will say that looking at the participant list is always great whenever we do these happy hours, because we see some familiar names, old warriors that have been in the trenches for a generation, as well as some new friends. I see my father-in-law's on there. And most importantly, most importantly, my father-in-law, but also a long-time donor. So thank you for that. I've been given about 10 minutes to talk about the changes in the administration and how that changes the work that Advocates for the West engages in, and specifically related to a couple cases that we have been undertaking for a while now, and will continue. So, no surprise, the first, right out of the box on Inauguration Day, President Biden and his administration issued 3 very important documents that guide public lands management and federal engagement of public lands. The first was an executive order, and I'm not going to go through this. Please note that this presentation will be on our website, so you can go back and look at it anytime you want. If I'm going too fast, because I really want to get to about a 25 to 30 minute discussion period. So, wow, was I muted that entire time?
No, you just muted yourself for a second there, Todd. You're good.
Oh.
And you have plenty of time. So
go
ahead.
All right. I now feel like the old guy here. Inauguration Day, Executive Order 13990 really expressed something we haven't seen ever, and a quote, abiding commitment to conserve our national treasures and monuments, places that secure our national memory. And in that executive order, President Biden directed every agency head to review every agency action that occurred from inauguration to inauguration, from the day President Trump came on board to the day President Biden came on board. Pretty staggering in its breadth. It also it started a process to restore Bears Ears and Grand Staircase national monuments. It barred the issuance of leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It pulled back the Keystone Pipeline and a whole host of other things. But for the first time, really, we have a publicly stated abiding commitment to conserve our national treasures. At the same time, this executive order came out, and it set forth a process. And I'm not going to get into details, but I can answer questions. It set forth a process for each individual agency to undertake a review of a Trump-era decision and re-examine and reconsider it. So there's a 30-day and a 90-day process to list them, and then there's a 1 year to 4 year process to reconsider. At the same time, acknowledging and noting that President Trump and Secretary Bernhardt were their foot was on the pedal, the gas pedal at the tail end of their administration, and they came out with a whole host of decisions. and acknowledging that there was also a secretarial order 3395 that was pretty broad in its scope. It temporarily suspended field office, state office, district office, BLM, and other agency authorities to issue dozens of types of decisions. For the next 60 days, they are barred from issuing NEPA reviews. They're barred from issuing resource management plans, rights of way, notices to proceed, plan of operations, and a whole host of other decisions. And the idea here is to bring a new set of eyes, a conservation-oriented, a President Biden-oriented set of eyes to these decisions to see if they should be examined, revoked, or vacated. And then the third and last thing that came out that very first day, I think this was actually the first one that came out, was the traditional regulatory freeze order memorandum that comes out from the chief of staff. And it basically froze the publication of any new decisions. It froze the submission of any new agency decisions or rules, and it froze the implementation of any agency rules that have yet to be finalized. So with those three, we got off to a pretty good start. What we did is we stopped the bleeding. This was not what we saw today. This was the first step. You know, I was talking to a friend who does this kind of work, and he said to me, he thinks that Biden administration from inauguration until today, maybe until Friday, has, if you pardon the sports analogy, it's been like a football game where the first 10 plays, the first 10 days are pre-scripted. There's nothing that's going to change. They know, the Biden administration knows exactly what they're going to do for the first 10 days. And then the game really begins. The advocacy game really begins. Next slide, please. Okay. And so then we have today, which was a pretty staggering day in terms of the breadth of the executive orders that came out today. And these are a handful of them. I'm not going to go over most of them because I'm already 3 minutes into my presentation. So what we have is several executive orders, one a climate executive order, and for purposes of what we do, it puts a temporary pause on the issuance of new oil and gas leases on public lands and waters. And at the same time, it adopts and prioritizes a review process of all the rules, procedures, processes that BLM undertakes in issuing oil and gas leases, fossil fuel leases on public lands. So that is both stops and then puts forth a process to engage, to review new oil and gas leases. And somehow it also eliminates fossil fuel subsidies, and it identifies a time frame for the agencies to submit to the Office of Management and Budget and identify all fossil fuel subsidies under their agencies. That is going to be a staggeringly important procedural process, because we will, for the first time, the government will account for the scope and breadth of all dollars and programs that are going to the fossil fuel companies to harm our public lands. Of course, there's a 35 by 30 commitment, which is a commitment to, and commits the federal government to a goal of conserving 30% of lands and waters by 2030. Now, none of these are self-executing, right? These are goals, these are policies, these are programs, but now the hard work begins in terms of how do we operationalize these policies, priorities, and goals. Next slide, please. What does it mean for day in, day out advocacy, day in, day out litigation? And when I think of this, I put the work into two buckets, one that I'm going to spend some time talking about and the other that I'm not going to. There is an entire bucket of what now we are pivoting, as Lizzy said, from defense to offense. There is an entire universe in front of us in terms of new policy initiatives that follow the framework, that implement the goals and objectives of these new climate change executive orders, that we can push forward. There's a Keep It in the Ground campaign. There's ideas on new policy initiatives for areas of critical environmental concern and wilderness study areas and national conservation areas. There's going to be new policy initiatives that are operationalizing these climate objectives regarding fire and vegetation treatments, grazing retirement. But that's not what we're here to talk about, because that is What I want to talk about is how does this change in administration, this change in the abiding commitments to conserve and protect our national treasures, how does that impact our litigation? And so there's basically three buckets there, and Lizzy's probably going to smile because I always talk about buckets. But it impacts us in different ways depending on where we find ourselves in the procedural process. So there's the first bucket is ongoing litigation. The second bucket is reversing recent Trump decisions that are not subject to litigation. And then the third is how do these policy priorities and abiding commitment to conserve and protect the national landscapes, how do they influence, how do we use those to influence future agency decisions? So this is where I'm going to spend the next 3 or 4 minutes and then hopefully open it up to questions. Next slide, please. So for ongoing litigation, this is going to be, this is why Tanya went before me, because this is going to be really fact specific and case dependent. There is going to be no one broad brush of stroke in terms of how do we prioritize and use these new climate change initiatives to influence settlement and existing cases. But there are opportunities. There are, depending on where we are, and I'll think about in the context of UFO, the Uncompahgre field office litigation. We are at the very early stages. We have filed a complaint. We're going to get the record. There is an opportunity to inject these abiding commitments that the Biden administration has adopted. Inject those into this case and see if the new Department of Justice wants to continue the litigation. Now, look, I've been doing this for 20 years or 18 years at Advocates and a little longer outside of Advocates. And the idea that all litigation is going to come to a stop and we've solved the problem and we all can go drink margaritas on the Mexican beaches all day, that's not going to happen. There is going to be active, aggressive litigation from today through the end of the Biden administration. I can guarantee you. But we, Advocates for the West, Lizzy, Tanya, and I, and all of our staff are going to be aware that it's a new day, and we might be able to inject these commitments, these conservation commitments, these climate change commitments into our cases. But it's going to be case dependent. And of course, even if Department of Justice and even if the agencies don't want to go as far as we want them to go, we'll litigate it. And these kind of commitments will come, we'll be able to present them at the back end when we get to remedies. So, we've done this before. In 2008, the last part of 2008, when we had President Obama elected but not yet inaugurated, our executive director, Laird, who I think's on the phone, and I created filed two enormous cases, one challenging several hundred resource management plans or scores of resource management plans across the American West, and I filed a litigation challenging several hundred grazing decisions across Idaho and Nevada. And we thought, well, maybe we can use the incoming Biden Obama administration to settle. That didn't happen right off the bat. It took us a couple of years of beating them over the head with it to get them to the settlement table. But there are always opportunities. We need to be flexible. We need to be realistic. And we need to take stock of where we are in the litigation community. There's a whole nother opportunity for cases that are not subject to litigation. How can we incorporate these new commitments into reversing agency decisions? And here's where this is the kind of exciting part for me. For the first time, we actually have established pathways to get a new set of eyes. The regulatory freeze, and more importantly, the executive order that I talked about, establishes processes where we can get new agency officials, new political appointees to get eyes on a decision. And here I'm thinking, and I know Lisa Rutherford and Richard Spots and other warriors down there in Southern Utah, this is what we're doing for Conserve Southwest Utah and CLF in the Red Cliffs case. We have a decision that came out 4 days before the end of the end of the Trump administration. And we anticipate using the executive order and the process and structure and framework in that executive order to put this in front of the new agency officials and really require them to take a fresh look at whether punching a 4-lane highway through a national conservation area and Mojave Desert tortoise critical habitat does in fact conserve, protect, and enhance the conservation values of that area. And then there's the third part, and this is also pretty exciting stuff in terms of how do we use the processes and framework and priorities of the Biden administration to influence future decisions. You know, we did this, Advocates for the West did this at the beginning and throughout most of the Biden Obama administration. But this is where we can have an immediate impact, because we now can hold agency officials, sometimes captured agency officials, agencies and officials that have been captured by the user groups, by the ranchers, by the oil and gas. We can hold them to the abiding commitments that the Biden administration has established through the executive orders, and look at every decision coming out through that filter. We need to make sure that, next slide, that our future action is not only relying on litigation, because litigation is the last bastion of opposition to agency decision. In many respects, we're back to where we were. Litigation is the last option. We have to build and develop advocacy campaigns to put these decisions that are harmful to the climate, that are harmful to our national treasures and monuments, areas that secure our national memory. We have to get those in front of the agency officials. In many cases, they're our friends and compatriots, and make sure that we are holding their feet to the fire. We cannot let down and not let Biden administration off the hook. So yes, we're going to have litigation. I guarantee it. We're going to have litigation starting as soon as necessary, and it's going to be going as long as we need. But we have to make sure that our defensive litigation is matched with an equally robust and developed advocacy strategy, so we hold the Biden administration officials' feet to the fire. I think I went way too long. I apologize.
No, Todd, that was fantastic. I'll add a couple of things. No, that was super helpful. We're very fortunate to have Todd on our staff. He lived in DC for several years and is very plugged in, so always has great perspectives on some of these political issues. But please start, if you have questions for us. I see they're starting to come in, but please let us know what's on your mind. If you want us to focus on specific things in the rest of our time. For now, though, I want to mention a couple of things. When you look back at the existing cases that I spotlighted in the beginning of my presentation to help give us some guidance for what we're going to be dealing with, there are some good examples that of what might happen that we can think about. So with our sage grouse oil and gas case, I mentioned that it's currently up on the sage grouse oil and gas case that's currently up on appeal. You know, that case shows the complexities that are facing the Biden administration with undoing some of the damage. You know, once the lessees obtain their leases that they paid for, you know, they want the right to continue to, you know, have those leases or be compensated if the leases are torn up. And so, you know, I won't bore you with some of the procedural and with some of the, oh, sorry about that, Tanya. I guess there's a typo in her email address. Make sure to note that if you're going to email her. Sorry, got a little distracted there, but yes, up on appeal. I mean, it's quite a complex situation trying to undo some of that damage. And so, you know, there are some things like these executive orders where you know, the new administration can come in and issue these, you know, broad proclamations and get us some wins right away. But the truth is, public lands management is complex, and you know, it's going to take a lot of time to figure out how to handle some of those decisions. And I think a couple of other examples of what might happen can flow from our existing cases. With the sage grouse management plan case that I mentioned, which is Laird Lucas, right? I guess you're here, our executive director, fantastic job on that litigation. But the truth is, we had an existing case filed over the Obama era sage grouse plans. And so, you know, we roll back the Trump rollbacks, but then, you know, we're left with plans that, you know, arguably still need to go further. And so, you know, restoring the status quo in some of these situations is not always you know, the best thing for our clients and our interests. I think the UFO RMP is another great example of that. The reason why the Trump administration issued that decision was because a planning process had been in the works for 10 years to get a new management plan there, because the old management plan is very old and is not good enough. And so, what's going to happen if that RMP gets vacated and sent back to the drawing board? That's a really good question that we're all going to have to figure out together. And just my last thought before I turn to, I see some really great questions that are starting to come in. And that's that, just think about the vast scope of things that BLM and Department of the Interior have on their plate right now. It is a lot, in addition to wanting to advance some of these fantastic new protective initiatives. They've got to undo all this existing crap. And so, yeah, it's going to be a lot to happen. And it'll be really interesting to see how fast some of that goes. All right. Todd, are you? Let's
I'll start reading through the questions here as they come in. Thank you all for submitting on here. I'm going to go ahead and just start with the first one we got from John Warren. How does the extensive use of executive orders by recent presidents affect what AFW does and how you proceed?
Who do you want to answer that?
Well, why don't you answer it, Todd? We talked about executive orders.
Hey, so this is, there's a couple observations that I have. The executive order that I cited, today's executive order that temporarily stayed, or I think the word was paused, temporarily paused oil and gas development. I think within an hour, give or take, of that executive order coming out, the industry sued. They sued in Wyoming. There's an existing lawsuit. It's about a 2-page lawsuit. It probably took them 15 minutes to pull together. And so the question for Advocates for the West regarding these executive orders, not regarding Trump executive orders, but regarding these, is we are going to be evaluating internally whether it is an effective use of our time and skills to engage in that litigation to try to bolster the Biden administration and Department of Justice. So that's one way that we're going to do it. So now go back 4 years and now look at the executive orders that President Trump issued. There's there's a lot of different types of executive orders, but the ones that were most prominent were the Antiquities Act orders that weren't actually executive orders, they were proclamations. Advocates for the West was assisting Conservation Lands Foundation over the course of the last 4 years, and a whole host of other clients, parties, in challenging those proclamations as unlawful. So there's going to be a rich opportunity to engage, to prop up and assist the Department of Justice in supporting President Biden's executive orders, and we have a history of engaging to challenge prior executive orders. In general, this for us, is an efficiency and efficacy issue. Does it make sense for us to engage and spend our limited time trying to support Department of Justice and trying to prop up Department of Justice? Those are just decisions that we have to make. It looks like I'm frozen. I hope you can still hear me.
We can hear you, Todd. Your screen is frozen. Hopefully you pop back on there, but I'm going to move on to the next question here, which I think, Todd, you will also probably be the best person to answer. Lynn's question regarding
Here, let me answer.
Can you read that? I'm sorry. I don't know if that's
it's a long question. I feel like the key question there is whether there's a potential for a moratorium on overhead transmission line projects.
So yeah, this is exact, and I still frozen, but I'm still here, I promise. This is exactly the kind of advocacy campaign I was talking about, that we have some framework through which to run a campaign. We now have a temporary suspension, so we don't have, for the next 60 days, Lynn, you don't have to worry about any decision coming out of BLM office that has not been approved in DC. Approving the Trans-Tech Express and Gateway South transmission line project. So that's part one. There's no immediacy. And then part two is there is opportunities to create advocacy campaigns. And if your goal is to get a moratorium on overhead transmission line projects, great. There is a framework to build that campaign, and that is to marry it with President Biden's focus on conserving our national treasures and monuments and places that secure our national memory. There are ways to build campaigns, and that's the last part of what I was talking about. We always had this in the past. We just didn't have the fully explored priorities of the administration like we do with the Biden administration.
Sorry, guys, I'm having a little trouble with my screen here.
Got it.
So
yes.
with Paul's next question, sorry, my mute button is just, yeah, anyway, it's Zoom stuff. With the new approach established by the Biden administration, do you think local officials in the Forest Service and BLM will be more receptive to retiring grazing allotments where the permit holder wants to do that?
Yeah, so here again, I'm sorry to say this, but the answer is the same. They're only going to do it if we build an affirmative advocacy campaign that forces them to do it. I mean, grazing retirement has been on the agenda for the conservation organizations in the American West for 25 years. And we've gotten some bills that allow for voluntary grazing retirement. Think of the Central Idaho Wilderness, think of down in the Gila, down in New Mexico. But there's been no broadly accepted effort west-wide to retire grazing. So if we can put together, we collectively, the conservation organization, conservation movement, put a campaign together to push the Biden administration, even though these folks are our friends, they're not going to want to go as far as retiring grazing. I can promise you that. But if we veil it in the framework of building resiliency into the Western public lands, if we build it into protecting frontline communities and creating economic opportunities that are not currently there for frontline communities, we may find that we get it's more positively received in DC. But that's on us. That's on us in pulling together campaigns. So I can't really answer that. I would hope so, but we've all been doing this for 20 years, and it's a pretty hard, grazing retirement's a pretty hard sell.
And I think, Todd, that was a great answer that I think also answers the next question from Michael. He asked about, given BLM's response to what the community wanted in the UFO case, how do we envision an effective advocacy effort? And I think Todd really nailed that. And I think the livestock raising issue that Michael raises is just a good example of some of the work that, it's unclear how much of that will really change under this administration. It's stuff that's very entrenched. It doesn't seem like a super high priority. And so I think that's a really good question. And I think hopefully Todd's answer addressed some of that.
I also want to point out that there could be mechanisms within the Biden administration that can change some of that BLM culture and some of those BLM priorities with, trying to put 30% of lands into conservation status by the year 2030. And I would say let's push for 24% by 2024. So we're not spending a whole term planning things and asking the next administration to follow through. I think this administration has given us different ways to frame our conservation messaging and our conservation advocacy. And so I think, I am cautiously optimistic. I also, in our particular case, in the Uncompahgre, we had a lot of community support and we also had local BLM support. And ultimately the alternative that was adopted in the record of decision was something that came from the administration on high. It came from DC down, essentially. So hopefully with the new administration, some things will change, but I do entirely hear, that there are some things that won't change just with the change of an administration.
Tanya, I am going to, so Richard Scully's question kind of takes us in a different direction. I'm going to read this off to you guys real quickly here. So the recent Columbia River System Operations EIS that was pushed through before the Trump administration ended does not provide measures to protect Snake River salmon and steelhead. These fish will continue to require ESA protection, and some species will likely move from threatened to endangered status. What can be done to prevent the inadequate preferred alternative from being carried out? I'm not sure which one of you would like to tackle that, but let's throw it out there.
Yeah, I can maybe give us a start. I think this also touches on, there was a question about a comment made by the new Secretary of Commerce that salmon recovery in the Northwest is a priority. And so I think, you know, there are a couple of key things to think about here that both of these questions touch on, and that's what NMFS, the National Marine Fisheries Service, can do. I think Richard, National Marine Fisheries Service is under the Department of Commerce. And they deal with the uplisting issue that Richard mentions. They're distinct from the Army Corps of Engineers who provided that preferred alternative, and you know, in some ways really is, you know, sits in the decision-making power there. And so you know, NMFS is a little more isolated from political interference, I think, in both respects. And so, you know, hopefully with the new executive order regarding scientific integrity, you know, NMFS will feel really empowered to stand up to the Corps and some of the other agencies, you know, and put forth science-based biological opinions. You know, it's obviously too late for NMFS in that instance to do the right thing. And so, you know, I think that the Columbia River power system is, you know, it is a big political issue, and I think there is a lot happening right now, and I think folks are more excited than ever that good things are going to happen. You know, and I think there's some that Biden and the administration can do, but I think it's really, you know, we need a deal from Congress, and so I think there is you know, a lot happening there. I think there was a lawsuit that was just filed challenging that decision that you referenced, the preferred alternative. And so, you know, I think that is a good example of, you know, where Todd sort of got at some of this, how you need like a multi-pronged strategies to tackle these pernicious conservation problems that have spanned different administrations. And so litigation, you know, political, you know, legislative, putting pressure on the administration, I think it's gonna take it all in that instance. And I know a lot of the folks that are on here right now are really concerned about the lower snake dams. And so, yeah, I'm with you there. We're hoping things really come together in the next couple of years.
Thanks, Lizzie. And since you're on the topic, I'm going to read off Tom Benson's follow-up that has to do with salmon. How significant is the fact that our new Secretary of Commerce just recognized salmon recovery in the Pacific Northwest as a serious priority?
Right. Sorry, that was one of the questions that I was trying to answer in saying that,
Yeah.
you know, NMFS is under the Secretary of Commerce. And so, you know, it's great that he said that. I think hopefully NMFS will, you know, get even stronger, but they're a little bit limited in what they can do. You know, I think, at least at this point with the Columbia River system.
Well, I just want to weigh in here and just make sure that, just to emphasize a point. So all of this is significant. This executive order is significant that came out today. The executive order from Inauguration Day is significant. The significance, you know, significant Commerce Secretary said this, but it's only significant if we put our work in to create the momentum through public advocacy campaigns to push them to operationalize these priorities. These will be nothing more than words on paper if we sit back and leave it to the bureaucrats to fix the problem. And I think this goes back to Richard Spock's email and conversation. We need to use the policies, priorities, and framework created in the first 7 days of the Biden administration to force them and the political appointees to do what we want, which is going to be more than they want. So sure, it's significant, but it's only significant if we work hard to force them to make changes.
Michael Herman, I'm just going to go ahead and answer a couple of your questions there. No Advocates for the West does not have a lobbyist on staff. And do we storm the Capitol? Well, I sure hope not. Let's really hope that, that's not on the agenda here.
Absolutely not.
No. So Louise, it's kind of an
Well, you
interesting
jump,
question.
yeah. So let's go.
What would you, well, I'll head back up. So those portions of the border wall that were built across the wildlife refuges and national monuments in Arizona, I know there are groups pushing to get them removed. How is this going to happen? I mean, if any of you has a.
So there's two parts to this, right, Louise? And thank you for your question. It's great to I wish I could see you, but it's great to have you here. So there's two parts to this question. The first part is stop the bleeding, and the second part is repair the cut, right? So right now, what we need to do in CBD and Sierra Club and Public Citizen are running hard to stop the bleeding, to stop the construction. I think news came out just yesterday that actually construction is ongoing and they're using some kind of emergency authorization to do it. What we need to do, this is a perfect example. What we need to do is marry Biden's administration's words with their deeds and force them to adhere to their stated priorities. And then, so that's the first priority. And then pulling it out, look, it goes right through Oregon Pipe Desert or Oregon Pipe National Monument, which is spectacular. It's going to be a hard one. We'll have to see how that works. We're not part of that litigation. I suspect if it gets to the table, it's going to be as part of a remedial phase of litigation, if there's not a proactive policy approach that the Department of Interior moves forward. So that's going to be a hard one, but I think we have to, I feel, and I am fighting the feeling of irrational exuberance. That is an unmitigated optimism, unbound by facts on the ground that tomorrow's going to be a better day. I believe if we put in the work, we can get a lot accomplished, which is more than I could have said in Trump, which is more than I said in Obama. And so it is a new day, but that just means we have to roll up our sleeves and get to work. And the work is going to be a little different. There's still going to be an absolute need for litigation, but there's an absolute need for aggressive, robust policy campaigns, public policy campaigns.
I think one thing I'll just add, thinking about the border wall, is really, again, just going back to that, how much stuff needs to be done in the next few years, and really thinking about priorities, and how advocates for the West and our partners rely on people like you to help identify where the real problems on the ground are. Because it's really easy to say in the abstract, okay, X number of miles of the border wall that were built, that was arbitrary and stupid and we need to yank them out. But folks on the ground who know where wildlife migration is being impeded, things like that can really help advocacy efforts, streamline and prioritize where things, need to happen. It is really fun seeing all of your questions here. I wish we could see you. I can feel the energy from some of you, and knowing many of you, it's just, we're really lucky to have supporters like you.
Yeah, lots of questions coming in. I want to make sure that I don't miss some of these. Sarah just submitted one a little earlier, asking whether or not wolves will be relisted or if this wouldn't be a high enough priority. I'm my guess on that, Sarah, is no, that they won't be. As much as I'd love to say yes, I think you're in Ketchum, which I definitely understand the desire there. But I think
so. I do want to get to Lynn's question regarding LWCF funding for conservation easements, including grazing lease buyouts or retirement, and then citing the El Paso natural gas settlement. I'm sure if Laird is still on it, he's smiling right now, because Advocates for the West played a very important role in that El Paso settlement, which to this day is spending millions of dollars pulling cows off public lands. So, but right now, as it stands, Lynn, I know a little bit about LWCF, and it cannot be used for grazing retirement. That would require a modification to the authorization statute. Note that it was just modified twice in the past 2 years. And so I love the idea. The time for that advocacy, unfortunately, may be behind us. If it's going to get opened up again, that is a fantastic idea, because you can build in all kinds of climate change issues, climate change remediation, economic revitalization of frontline communities into that argument. And so I really love it. But right now it can't be. I'm unaware of its capacity to be used that way. It can be used for conservation easements on the state side, but not on the federal side. It's only a fee title ownership.
Looks like we have another Advocates for the West staffer joining us. Hi, Amy. Amy Moran is on. What's going on? Are you muted?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Sorry, my computer's a little funky today. Hello, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Well, I want to make sure I didn't miss anybody's questions here. It looks like we have answered them all for the most part here. I see they're hopping around a little bit here. Sorry, folks, on my screen. Every time somebody. So if Biden is looking at fossil fuel subsidies, what about below cost grazing fees?
Yeah, $1.35 is hard per animal unit month is hardly sufficient justification or sufficient payment to offset the cost of the livestock grazing program in the Forest Service and BLM. I hear you. I'm a broken record here, guys. Right, I agree 100%. Let's do it. There are groups that have been working on it for 20 years that have been very effective at it. I don't know if raising the grazing fees is part of their strategy, but what we have is we have infinite possibilities in front of us. Are we careful enough to reduce those infinite possibilities to a handful of priorities and get those priorities accomplished? I don't know the answer to that, but I hear you. It's outrageous.
All right, well, we are at 6 o'clock. I think you guys have done a fantastic job of answering questions. You all have done a great job of asking questions. Thank you so much. This has been a really engaging conversation. It's been great to see so many questions come in. This has been the most engaged audience that we have had. So thank you so much. And
can I just say one thing before you go? And I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, and I do have one more thing to say as well too. Go ahead.
If your question was not answered, you have our emails right in front of you.
Yes.
Just email us the question and we'll get back to you.
Yeah, Tanya, what is your email address so that I tried to change it on the screen, but my computer's being funky, so.
No worries. It's just Tanya at theconservationcenter.org. Okay. Just a simple article.
Okay, everybody, Tanya at theconservationcenter.org. Please send us questions if you have any. Like I said, I will send this out again so that you have a link to this recording. And I do want to just say again, thank you so much for all of your support. We really couldn't do this work without each and every one of you. So thank you for supporting our work. Please consider supporting the Western Slope Conservation Center as well and all of the great work that they do. And keep supporting and keep backing and standing next to us as we work on this important work. So we're really glad to have you all here. Watch for a link to our next social distancing hour, which we're doing these the last Wednesday of every month. So you can kind of keep that in your hat, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks to our panelists, and thank you all for joining us. We'll see you again next time.